Okay, so my name is Gillian Coleman. I am the Assistant Head of Discipline for Diagnostic Imaging at the University of Derby, but also a representative on case committee for the Society of Radiographers as well, and an accreditor. So I'm here in multiple roles, as it were. We're going to talk about the recognition of prior learning mapping to case standards. Okay, I think everyone's muted now. So just to start off with, because I realise that some accreditors are from HEI backgrounds, but some aren't, so might not fully know regarding recognition of prior learning. So just a bit of a definition here in terms of what RPEL is. I'm going to keep calling it RPEL moving forward though, because rather than saying the full recognition of prior learning all the way through. So it's a process for assessing learning achieved outside or within formal education, which can be recognised if appropriate for academic processes. So it can be used to gain credit within a programme if the learning outcomes are comparable to entry requirements of the programme to gain credit within the programme. It's sometimes called accreditation of prior learning, APEL as well. So different HEIs might use different terminology throughout. So it's worth acknowledging that it might be different in documentation across different HEIs as well. Next slide, please, Jill. So for each HEI, they'll have their own regulations with regards to RPEL. And it's really important that as programme leads or directors, that there is an understanding of what your academic regulations are for RPEL within your own individual HEI. But also there may be programme-specific derogations to the university regulations as well. So it's really important that programme teams are aware of this, particularly when it comes to accreditations, because that needs to be clear in all documentation as to what the approach is and how this is or is not applied within their programmes. So there may be a variety of approaches, or it may be relatively consistent, but what should happen is that there should be a rigorous approach to this. It should be consistent, so that if one student applies for it and then another student does, that they both have that robust approach. You as a programme team know what is happening, and as accreditors we know what programme teams are doing to appraise RPEL. So it needs to be considered how you ensure that there is a consistent approach to this. Is there documentation that's used for evidencing this? Is there a pro forma that's completed? How do you keep records of this to ensure that learning is being mapped in a rigorous way? So programme teams should be clear about what documentation is being used to ensure that there is full appraisal of the student learning to assess for equivalence of UK standards of practice. Next slide, please, Jill. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the HEI responsibilities, and then we'll talk a little bit further about what accreditors should be looking for in terms of RPEL. So each HEI has a responsibility to ensure that there is a clear, consistent and fair approach being applied to all learners who apply for RPEL. And this also includes that there should be full equivalence of the entry requirements for the programme, and this might be things such as English language proficiency. The HEI will need to ensure that the clinical competency is equivalent to the UK standards. So this is particularly relevant if it is a clinical module that is being applied for RPEL to be used for. And there needs to be clear evidence of how that HEI has determined that competence from the clinical aspect, but also that the learning is equivalent to the case standards that are required. Next slide, please, Jill. And so in terms of the documentation that might be used by the HEI for review of RPEL, it can form a variety of different documents that may be reviewed as part of this RPEL appraisal process. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all, and in terms of where that qualification has been gained, there may be a variety of documents that are provided by the student, the learner, or that you may request as a programme team. So it could be programme and module learning outcomes, the handbooks, content delivery, transcripts. What commonly comes through is qualification certificates, which don't exactly give a lot of information in terms of what is required for us to be able to map. But learners who are applying for RPEL should be able to provide documentation to support this review of evidence to decide whether it is appropriate, whether it is equivalent, and whether RPEL can be applied against those credits. There should also be some evidence of what the assessment methods are, and that enables that evaluation of the practical assessment of clinical skills and clinical competency to make sure that it does meet the UK standards. But what's really clear is that regardless of the country of the qualification and where that's been gained, there still needs to be a robust review of documentation for all applications for RPEL. And so this ensures that consistency in that application of the RPEL process. Next slide, please, Jill. So in terms of what HEI's programme team should be looking for, we should be looking at what the module learning outcomes are for the modules that the learner has undertaken and whether these meet the learning outcomes of the programmes that we're running. Do these meet up to or map up to their case standards? Are these equivalent of the modules that we are teaching to enable that RPEL to take place? So looking at the module content, that might involve the documentation such as timetables, module handbooks. Does that cover the content that should be delivered for that module, whether that is a clinical or a non-clinical module? Are there any gaps in that content that aren't being covered that should be covered from a case perspective? How is that content delivered? So having a look at what learning that student has done. Is it a very short module where they've just had a very short amount of teaching to enable them to gain that, or have they had an extensive module which has supported that? And what practical skills assessment has taken place? So obviously from a case perspective, there should be the pass-fail competency assessment to ensure that it meets the UK standards of practice. So having a look at that documentation to see, is there a clinical competency assessment? Is it a pass-fail? Who's done that assessment? How's that been done, and in what delivery method for that? So these are all elements that as HEIs we should be looking at when we are reviewing modules and learners' records for RPEL. Next slide, please, Jill. So when undertaking that review of RPEL, every HEI will have its own process for that in terms of what should be done. And obviously, programme teams will need to conform to that. But it's worth thinking about what evidence as a programme team you need to be keeping to be able to evidence that you have thoroughly assessed that learner's content and to ensure that it does map across. What are you going to do if you haven't already got something in place? It's worth considering, how do you keep that clear record to support the review of that? And this is really important because should a decision be appealed, how are you going to evidence how you've actually gone through that process and thought about that learner's learning that they've done? So next slide, please, Jill. So it's worth considering, in addition to any process that you might already have within your university, what you might do to record that. And this is just an example of some of the elements that you might want to keep a record of, or that as case accreditors, we might want to be able to see what teams are doing to be able to record the evidence of how RPEL has been mapped and applied. So having some sort of pro forma, so this is just an example of things that you might want to keep a record of in terms of how that has been appraised, who's done that appraisal, what documents have been provided to support that appraisal. So how have you actually reviewed that documentation and come to that decision? And have you identified any gaps in the learning for those modules that the student is asking for review of? Are the module learning outcomes aligned? What the assessment is, which obviously is a really important aspect as well. And does it map equivalent to the case equivalence of learning, and provide some sort of justification. This is no steadfast way of doing it, and everyone will have their own approach, but it's just a suggestion of a way that it could be recorded to make sure that there is a clear and consistent approach to this, and it is a robust approach, so that every learner and every student that applies for that programme is gaining that same review. Next slide, please, Jill. So when mapping RPL, there can be challenges along the way. I've experienced many, I'm going to put that out there. So it is challenging when there is incomplete mapping. So if there's insufficient documentation to support you in being able to map to your own module learning outcomes, or if that mapping doesn't quite meet the case standards. So it's considering whether it fully meets the standards, whether it fully provides the content that there should be for that module, or whether there is some inconsistencies there that do not allow for that RPL to be applied. It can be difficult when there's insufficient documentation, and that's where you can ask for further information from that student. And they should, if they don't have that documentation, that content, they should be able to reach out to their HEI and gain that. But ultimately, if you don't have that sufficient documentation, then you're not going to be able to map to your own programme or to the case standards. And again, I'll just reiterate that it's irrelevant whether that learner has learned in the UK or in a different country. Every student should have their documentation appraised in the same way to ensure that there is that robust review of documentation and that consistent application of the RPL process. But from time to time, you will have challenges to this, and you may have student complaints as well. And again, this leads into having that standardised approach, that robust approach to it, and also the documentation and evidence that you will keep to be able to support you in that. If you go next slide, please, Jill. And obviously, if you do get a complaint, it's important that the HEI process is followed for complaints that do come through. And again, every HEI will have a different process for that. Having that clear documentary evidence of how you've approached the RPL review is really important, though, for you to then be able to evidence and justify your decisions and how you've reached those. And there could be really clear indications as to why that module cannot be RPL'd in. But it's really important that you have that documentation so you can clearly say, these are the reasons why we've not been able to do that. Next slide, please, Jill. So CASE released a position statement on RPL November last year, I believe it was, which provides some clear guidance for HEIs and the importance of a clear and consistent approach to this, but also providing some outline for accreditors as well, in terms of what the responsibilities are of the accreditors and what to look out for. So that's available via the CASE website. Next slide, please. But just to summarise some of the key elements that we as accreditors should be looking for. And so obviously we've talked about that consistent approach, the evidence, the record keeping. And so when we are accrediting programmes, what we need to be looking at is that there is a clear process in place for RPL. And that shouldn't just be what the standard university process is, but what are the programme teams actually doing to be able to look at RPL? And being specific about what is and what is not allowed. So, for example, can credits be added to the programme for RPEL, so recognised prior experiential learning? So it's things like that that we should be looking at. What are the programme teams wanting to be included within their programme? What do their regulations allow? Are there any derogations to that they are proposing, which may mean that they have slight variances on that? And do they have that clear evidence process for reviewing RPL applications? And that's where the documentation comes in. what process are they following? How are they evidencing that? How are they keeping the records to show what process they're following? And do they provide any support for learners to evidence prior learning at the appropriate academic level? So it might be that they do provide support for that. They might not. It might be an application process that the student needs to fill in prior to commencing the programme. There can be variances across HEIs. So it's something we need to look at to see what is actually being undertaken within each individual programme. There should be detail of how the Academic Assessment Board, how the external examiner oversees this. So is there involvement from these when it comes to mapping of evidence and undertaking this RPL process? What oversight does the Academic Board have with regards to that? And there should be evidence of any training that the assessors, so the programme team, anyone who's undertaking that RPL process, what are they actually doing to ensure that they are following that robust process? Have they had any training to do that? How do they know that they are mapping to the correct standards, as it were? Next slide, please, Jill. And so when we're looking at it as accreditors, what we want to be looking at is, how is that documentation reviewed? What is it that they're actually doing within that programme team to do that? And who is it that does that process? Is it the programme teams themselves? Is it an administrative process? If it is an administrative process, then who is it who does that? Is it someone who has knowledge of the programme learning outcomes? Is it someone who has knowledge of what the case standards are? And how are they ensuring that clinical competence to the UK standards? So having a think about what they're actually doing to evidence this in practice within their programmes. And to a certain extent, obviously using the UK ENIC is useful in terms of the academic equivalence, particularly if it is from an international qualification. But that isn't going to be able to tell us whether that person is having the same content and whether it maps to the case standards. So we do need to be careful where this is being used. Actually, this isn't the only thing that is being used to map across that content and that delivery. So it's thinking about that. You preempted me, Joe. Thinking about that, thinking about the processes of what they're using in practice to map their RPL. Now you can go next slide, Jill. There's just a couple of references there. Obviously, there's the link to the case position statement there, and also QAA Scotland, which is where that reference from. Next slide, Jill. Very short but sweet. Oh, it doesn't say thank you. So thank you for listening. That's just an overview of RPEL and where HEIs can be looking at it, and also where us as accreditors can be looking at the documentation that programme teams are using.